know, O Prince, that between the years when the oceans drank Atlantis and the gleaming cities, and the years of the rise of the sons of Arius, there was an age undreamed of, when shining kingdoms lay spread across the world like blue mantles beneath the stars. Hither came Conan the Cimmerian, black-haired, sullen-eyed, sword in hand, a thief, a reaver, a slayer, with gigantic melancholies and gigantic mirth, to tread the jeweled thrones of the earth under his sandaled feet. Hello there, fellow travelers. I'm Tim from Secret Fire Books, and today we're diving back into one of my favorite fantasy worlds of all time, with one of my favorite fictional characters of all time. This is Marvel's Conan the Barbarian, Epic Collection number 1. So this epic collection contains the first 13 issues of Conan the Barbarian as it was originally published by Marvel Comics. I've been reading it for about the past 3 months or so, one issue at a time between all of the novels and other books that I've been reading, and I really enjoyed it. I think there's some really good stuff right here in this epic collection. Like I said, it's the first 13 issues, a little history about the series. Obviously, it's based off of the original Conan the Barbarian stories by Robert E. Howard that were written in the 1930s. And after Robert E. Howard's unfortunate death in 1936, the popularity of Conan kind of stagnated, because if you didn't have the individual issues of Weird Tales and the other pulp magazines that he was writing for, you didn't really have a way to read his stories. But fortunately, Ace Paperbacks came along and picked up the rights to the Conan series. They published their own paperback series to keep it alive. And it's that series itself is a little contentious among fans because they were edited by Lynn Carter and L. Sprague de Camp, and they made some pretty controversial decisions, let's say. But ultimately, they did keep the Conan intellectual property alive. And then in the late 60s, a young up-and-coming writer at Marvel Comics by the name of Roy Thomas brought up to Stan Lee and the other editors at Marvel that they should acquire the rights to Conan and make a Conan the Barbarian comic book series. And as a sort of proof of concept, he and an equally up-and-coming young artist by the name of Barry Windsor-Smith worked together on a short story for Marvel's Chamber of Darkness, which was a horror comic that they published at the time. As you can see, there's the cover of that particular issue of Chamber of Darkness, and then there's the splash page for their short story, The Sword and the Sorcerer. Now, it's not Conan, obviously, but it is a very Conan-esque figure. This is Star the Slayer. Very original name, Star the Slayer. But the story is ultimately about a sword and sorcery writer who gets fed up writing all the same stories over and over again. And he decides to kill off his main character, Star the Slayer, and sort of move on to something else. And so the next day, while he's walking around town, his own character, Star the Slayer, appears before him magically, stabs him to death in an alleyway, and that's the end. It's this real dark gallows humor that you get with horror comics in the 60s and such. But it served as the proof of concept that there was a market for sword and sorcery themed comic books going forward. And so in 1970, Roy Thomas and Barry Windsor-Smith were given the opportunity to work on a full-fledged Conan the Barbarian comic book. Now, it was originally supposed to be a monthly comic series, then I think it was moved to bi-monthly, and then I think it moved back and forth a couple times, but ultimately it went on for several years, several decades. In fact, I think it stopped in the early to mid-90s, after which it was acquired by Dark Horse, who did their own spin-off of Conan. But it kept Conan, once again, it kept him in public consciousness. And honestly, I don't think it would be popular. The Conan series would not be as popular today if it weren't for this comic book. In fact, I know it wouldn't be, because Roy Thomas himself would go on to write a film treatment for Conan, which would eventually become the original script of the Conan the Barbarian movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger and James Earl Jones. But enough of the history lesson. What do I actually think of these comics? I think they're really good, for the most part. I think if you've never read Robert E. Howard before, if you've never read Conan before, I think this is a really good introduction to Conan and to the universe that he lives in. Obviously, if you've never read Howard before, you should start with the original Conan stories. You should get one of these. This is the The Coming of Conan the Cimmerian. This is the first in a trilogy of paperbacks that was published by Del Rey Books. And they collect all of the original Robert E. Howard Conan stories as they were originally written for Weird Tales magazine and the other pulp magazines that Howard wrote for. But if for whatever reason you're not going to read the original pulps, I think you could do much worse than with this epic collection, with these first 13 issues of the Marvel series. It is mostly original material. There are a few issues that adapt material from Howard's original writings. In this volume alone, we get The God in the Bowl, The Tower of the Elephant, Rogues in the House, and Keepers of the Crypt, which, to be fair, is a summary. It started out as a summary for a short story that Robert E. Howard never finished. But the writers had access to it, so they sort of built their own narrative around it, and they made a whole issue based off of that synopsis. But the rest of it is original material, and that kind of varies in quality. I think the adaptations of Howard's original stories are really great. In fact, I think the comic adaptation of Tower of the Elephant it's one of the greatest issues of a comic book I've ever read, in my opinion. But all the original stuff kind of varies in quality. So you get some really, really good adventures, and then you get some kind of so-so adventures that sometimes they don't really even make sense. Sometimes they're just there to, kind of push Conan along because they needed to put out an issue that month. And so they just slapped him in this sort of generic storyline where he fights a big monster, or he gets captured and thrown in prison, for the 100th time that week. But, yeah, for the most part, I think it's really enjoyable, really good, pulpy, 1970s comic book goodness. And so it's definitely worth a read. So now let's talk about The Elephant in the Room. Not that one. These are comic books. They are sequential art. So how good is the art in these comics? Well, it's not bad, but I do have some hang-ups. As I said, these were initially illustrated by Barry Windsor-Smith, or as he went by at the time, Barry Smith. Not sure where the Windsor came from. He was relatively new at Marvel at the time, relatively young artist, very talented. As you can see from this cover for Keepers of the Crypt and the following splash page, he has a really good eye for detail. All of his backgrounds are very detailed. They look very interesting, very cool. I also think he has a really good eye for movement and action. In a lot of his action sequences, when characters are jumping or running and moving around, he does a pretty good job of drawing how their hair or clothes, or their bits and bobs, and their necklaces or bracelets or whatever, how they would react to that movement. It's very kinetic. It's very interesting looking. But I do think he has a few flaws as an artist, and the one weakness of his that I keep seeing pop up is that he draws human faces in a very strange way. Or at least the expressions on those faces. In fact, there's a page in later in this issue that I think illustrates that point perfectly. Here it is. Not sure what's going on with some of the faces on this page. Conan's eyes seem to have shrunk by about 80%. This guy's eyes are bulging out of his sockets. Yeah, not sure what's going on with that. There's just a lot of times where he'll draw someone's face and the expression is just really weird, really goofy. But he does get better over the course of these 13 issues. Just within these 13 issues, you do see how Barry Windsor-Smith's art style kind of matures and evolves. In fact, I'll throw up a few images that compare and contrast how well his art style develops and how he starts to... I think he finally starts to get the hang of drawing faces near the 13th issue of the Conan series. He did the first 24 issues of the series, I believe, after which John Buscema would jump on as the lead artist. And from John Buscema, we got some really spectacular art. In fact, he would kind of codify the particular Marvel look of Conan. Conan became a lot bulkier, a lot more rugged looking. Kind of looks like a Neanderthal almost. He has that very, short, square cut black hairdo that he's famous for, which is actually more faithful to the books, as a matter of fact. What's really interesting is that we get a really good contrast in art styles in the Epic Collection itself, because in issue 12, at the end of issue 12, we get a short story titled The Blood of the Dragon, which is illustrated by Gil Kane, who at this point is, a legend of comic books. Did a lot of work for both DC and Marvel. And it's like night and day between his art style and Barry Smith's. Because, as you can see, Gil Kane draws faces and expressions really, really well. All you have to do is look at these characters' faces and you know exactly what kind of character they are, exactly what they're thinking, what they're feeling. There's a lot of personality in his characters' expressions. But at the same time, his backgrounds are very simplified. A lot of times the background will just be a solid color or, just a very flat-looking background with not a lot of detail. So it's really interesting seeing that sort of generational gap in comic book artists. But this is a really cool little short story set in the Hyborian Age universe that has nothing to do with Conan. They just thought they'd draw a little extra story to give sort of a world-building aspect to the Hyborian Age, I suppose. It's really cool stuff. Now, if there's any big problem with these comics, it's pretty much something that couldn't have been helped at the time. It was the 70s, so these comics were still under the influence of the Comics Code Authority. If you don't know what that is, the Comics Code Authority was essentially a set of rules and regulations that lasted from the 50s all the way up until the early 2000s, I believe. And it prevented artists and writers from putting anything too extreme into their comics. It cut down on a lot of the violence and the sexual elements and the social political elements that had appeared in comics beforehand. It essentially tried to make comic books a lot more politically correct and a lot more safe and accessible to younger audiences. And that's a problem because Conan, as he was originally written in the pulps by Robert E. Howard, was not a politically correct character. He was not a character for younger audiences. His stories were not politically correct. They were not meant for young readers. But Marvel had to work with what they had to work with, and so they basically neutered Conan in his own series. So the original pulps were very violent, and there is quite a bit of action in these comics, but there's not a lot of violence. Every once in a while, Conan will get punched in the face, and you'll see a small dribble of blood down his cheek. But there's no dismemberment, there's no decapitations. Conan in the comics was known for, wooing wenches and bedding wenches and certain, sexual deviancies. None of that in the comics. The most risque thing that you'll see is, there'll be a woman framed in the background and she'll have her bare back exposed, but that's about it. They really had to dumb Robert E. Howard's material down in order to make a acceptable comic book series that would have been accepted by the Comics Code Authority. But fortunately, Conan the Barbarian made a lot of money for Marvel, sold a lot of copies, and I think Marvel came to realize what demographic they were appealing to most. Because eventually, in the late 70s, they would release Savage Sword of Conan. And if you couldn't tell from this cover, they did not hold anything back. Savage Sword of Conan was a magazine, not a comic book, a magazine that was printed by Marvel. It is entirely in black and white. It has editorials, it has Q&A sections, letters from the authors and artists, had pin-ups. It was a full-fledged Conan the Barbarian magazine. And so basically, the way Marvel figured, if we make a magazine, not a comic book, a magazine, it won't be subject to the Comics Code Authority, so we can get away with basically whatever we want. And they did. So, Savage Sword of Conan was a lot more violent, there was a lot more swearing, there was quite a bit of nudity, tasteful nudity, but nudity nonetheless. And it became the Conan comic for older readers, while the kids could still, read their full-color, funny pages Conan the Barbarian comics. But ultimately, I do think that Marvel's Conan the Barbarian is well worth a read. These comics were very influential at the time, especially on the sword and sorcery genre. There was actually a resurgence in popularity for sword and sorcery in the 1970s due to the financial success of this comic book. DC would eventually publish their own sword and sorcery series called Sword of Sorcery, and that had the characters Fafford and the Grey Mouser, who were pulp fantasy characters written by Fritz Leiber, who I will eventually talk about. I do really like Fafford and Grey Mouser. I have to get around to reviewing those books eventually. If you're in the mood for some good, cheesy 1970s comic book goodness with a side of sword and sorcery, then definitely check out these Conan comics. If you want something a little darker and grittier, then stick with Savage Sword of Conan. The individual issues are super hard to find nowadays. The collected editions are really expensive, but I think you can get ebook versions for pretty cheap. And there's also the Dark Horse collections. Marvel would eventually regain the rights to Conan in the 2010s, and so they were allowed to print Dark Horse's run of Conan. So I have the first 2 volumes right here, which I will be reading eventually. And I just now realized, didn't realize when I bought this, but I just now realized that you get some Mike Mignola art in volume 2. That's awesome. I love Mike Mignola. But yeah, guys, let me know. Have you read these Conan comics? Who's your favorite version of Conan? Is it the one from the comics? Is it the one from the movies? Please don't say Jason Momoa. We don't like to talk about Jason Momoa. But until next time, guys, keep reading.
Conan, what is best in life? To crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and to order a copy of Sand and Steel, available now on Amazon.com.
What am I doing?